I'd like to invite back up Dr. Jerald T. Milanich.
That title slide looked better when I saw it the other day. That's supposed to be a fire. That represents the end of everything. As I said this morning, I'm focusing on what I call the depressive part of the program. What happened to the missions? Why don't we have Spanish missions today? What happened to the Indians who lived at these missions and who interacted with the Spanish? One of the astounding things is that over approximately 200 years, the Indians that live in what was the mission provinces, including those, the Wali on the Georgia coast, the Timucua Indians in northern Florida, southeastern Georgia, and the Appalachia over in northwest Florida, probably, that's I think a high number, 350, but 250 to 350,000 in 1492. And by 1763, when the Spanish gave up the La Florida colony, Great Britain got it, the number was down to essentially zero. The several hundred Indians that still lived in Florida at the time were moved out. And so I'm going to tell you the story of what happened. I'm always interested in how many Indians there are today. We got a long way to go. And I looked at the 2010 census, and there are about a little over 71,000 people in Florida who claim to be, or not who claim to be, who declare that they have are Native Americans, and there's another 91,000 who declare they are both American Indians and mixed with another race. But that's a lot of people, but we've still got a way to go to get back to how many were here in many years ago. There were two problems with the missions. One is that over those 200 years that Spain controlled Florida, disease, not necessarily pandemics, but localized epidemics that may affect one or two or three or four missions or mission areas, caused the population to decline. Some people, as John Worth reminds me sometimes, people simply left the missions. They wanted to get out. Essentially what happens is fewer people are born than people who died, and so populations become less and less. And the other thing that happens is that the Indians who lived at the missions got caught up in geopolitics. Beginning, as has been said several times, in 1670, the English, how are we doing here, folks? I guess we don't reach over there. Yeah, we are. The English began moving down the coast, as I mentioned before. In 1670, they found Charleston down here. The French are coming down the Mississippi River, and so here's little Spain in this area who can have their colony, and they're getting a lot of pressure from the French over here and the Spanish down here. So it's a matter of time before the French and the British begin to put the pressure on Spain. They want to toss Spain out and take over that area. Florida's an important area because of its location relative to the Caribbean. And I've stole a whole series of maps here from John Worth's book that's out there you can buy called The Struggle for the Georgia Coast. But it's a fascinating account of what happens, first in Wally and the area down the coast a little bit. And here is the list of missions along the coast at about the mid-17th century. They come from way up here, sort of in northern Georgia on the coast, Santa Catalina, other ones here, one on Sapelo Island, so on and so forth, all the way down to St. Augustine. And things are going along swimmingly. But after Britain, or the English, take over at Charlestown, they begin raiding the coastal missions. There are both just Indians, some of which apparently came all the way down from Virginia to raid the missions. There are so-called pirates, whoever they are, who raid some of the missions, and it becomes very apparent to the Spanish that they're unable to protect the missions in Wally from the coast, and they start moving people farther down. So missions that were up here at Santa Catalina on St. Catherine's Island, Georgia, gets moved all the way down here to Amelia Island, Florida. So in the 1680s, they're starting what I call and others have called the abandonment of the missions on the Georgia coast. And so after 1685, I think I skipped a slide here. Yeah, I did. What I didn't mention is because of the presence of the British in the Carolinas and the traders in the interior, there's a lot of disruption among the Creek Indians, or the people that become the Creek, and there are a lot of refugee Indians that try to seek safety and move to the coast. And so the Spanish set up a number of additional missions with the people that are called Yamasee Indians. I looked in a dictionary once, and Yamasee in the Hitchiti Creek Indian tongue means tame. And I've often wondered if Yamasee was just a word that was picked up by the Spaniards or other Europeans and used to refer to the Creek Indians who came to live under the auspices of the missions, of the Spanish missions. So anyway, by 1685, the entire Georgia coast is pretty well abandoned, at least of the missions, and the northernmost mission along the coast is here on the north end of Amelia Island. St. Augustine is going to be down here. This is pretty much abandoned. And so we have the British up here in the Carolinas, and Spain's New World Empire sort of ends right here at the north end of Amelia Island. And this would become a contested area as Spain wanted more and more and more to move down, take over that area, and kick out those Spaniards. Not only are they raiding or engineering raids on the Georgia coast, there are also raids that come down into the area of Timucua. And we've seen this slide several times with we call them the little way stations, the Hilton Garden Inns in the woods here. 1685, one of the missions here, Santa Catalina, raiders come down probably in canoes, maybe down on the Swanee, and then coming overland, destroy the mission. Some of the Indians are killed. They take back Indians and sell them into slavery in South Carolina. Some probably were slaves in South Carolina. Others may actually have been traded down into the Caribbean. 1691, the mission of San Juan, which is over here on the Swanee River, wherever that is. Doesn't matter, I promise, it's there. But here it is. San Juan de Wakata. Wakata is the name, the Timucuan name for the Swanee River, and San Juan later becomes known as San Juani or Swanee River. That's where the name comes from. But I think both of these are attempts by the British really to cut, as I think John said before, or cut the route that went from St. Augustine out here into Appalachia. And I've often wondered if they didn't hit Santa Cruz by mistake. They were actually looking for something over here, maybe San Juan, and so they go back. So for the first time, this road has been cut. And then after that, things really go to hell in a hurry. Because they've lost so many mission peoples to disease and for other reasons, the Spaniards begin to look for other populations. They want people to come and provide the labor that they need. And so they, in 1695, they tried to establish a Franciscan mission down at Mound Key at Escambabe. Doesn't last very long. It's a flop. Also way down the St. Johns River among the, what are we called, the Mayaca Indians. And then there are several others that are attempted in Osceola County, probably Highland County. I'm trying to see if I said those three here. I think it's the next one. But they just flop. They don't work out. And then beginning in 1702, it's the big time destruction of the missions. The Santa Fe mission, which is north of Alachua, Florida, in Alachua County, north of Gainesville, gets hit in 1702. And they really then, the contact along the road, travel along the road has been impacted severely. Timucua Indians that were at some of the missions simply head out somewhere, probably down into Peninsula Florida, and then it's even worse. In November 1702, Colonel James Moore, who was the governor of Charlestown formerly, organizes a militia of, I always think what they do, everybody, let's get your guns, boys, and we'll go down to Florida. But they also had a lot of help from Creek Indians and other Indians, and they moved down the coast, likely in canoes, and wipe out all of the missions from the north end of Amelia Island all the way down to St. Augustine. San Juan del Puerto, which was a mission that was there since 1595, is gone after 107 years, destroyed. And eventually, what happens as a result of this raid is that Spain's La Florida colony ends at St. Augustine. Everything all the way down from Amelia to St. Augustine is simply gone. The Indians haul out of there, they go hide. James Moore and the militia lay siege to the town of St. Augustine. And the Spaniards know they're coming, and so everybody grabs everything they can, and they head into the fort, and there they withstand a siege of about a month or so. Colonel James Moore, one of I rank him right up there with Andrew Jackson as a nasty SOB. His folks not only burned St. Augustine, destroying most of the villages, but they burned the Franciscan mission that was in the Franciscan headquarters in St. Augustine that purportedly was one of the better libraries in the Americas, whether that's true or not. But can you imagine if we had the materials that were there, who knows, the missing Timucua dictionary and everything else, it must have been very hard on the Indians. Anyway, the only people that are really killed in this siege are some Spaniards who overloaded a cannon and it blew up and did some damage to them. But Moore finally figures that we don't have the kind of firepower, we don't have explosive shells that we can lob into the fort there in St. Augustine, and so we'll leave. But the damage was done. The missions north of St. Augustine were, as I said, gone. Native peoples have scattered. Some have gone west, some moved north, some went south to hide or to get away from things. And then it gets worse, if you can believe it. In 1704, Moore leads another raid of militia into Appalachia that Rochelle Marinette had mentioned, and kills again a lot of the mission Indians, and horribly, some of the Indians are burned at the stake. People are flayed alive. Devastation that must have been horrific for the Indians and scared them to death. And one of the Indians aren't dumb. They know what's going on, and when they can see that the Spaniards aren't going to be able to protect them, some of them simply change sides, and they leave with Moore and the militia and head north with them. Others, I'm sure, also fled the scene. Later that year, again, the Carolinians raided for the second time in Appalachia, and at that point, the destruction was so much that the Spaniards declared that they would abandon the province. And many of the Appalachia, not many, some of them headed west, as Rochelle noted. They went first to Mobile, and then they headed up north, or farther west, to well, first they went to Pensacola and then to Mobile, and then later on moved west and north and ended up in Louisiana. And in 1836, a census of that area lists the Apalachicola Indians as residents of New Orleans. Then later still later in 1704, the Timucua missions were hit, and everything has just fallen apart at that point. There was an attempt by some of the refugee Appalachi to establish a village in Timucua, but that couldn't last either. And so by about 1710, the missions are gone in interior North Florida. The refugees that didn't go west, like the Appalachi, have moved much closer to St. Augustine, and the Spaniards simply start new missions close to St. Augustine, where the Indians hope they're going to be protected. That's not Timucua Indians, but I like the image here of that thing. But Florida is essentially no Spanish presence outside of Pensacola and St. Augustine. And so raiders from the north, Indians, can move down all the way as far as they want to go in Florida, capture, raid Indians, take whatever they have, take Indians back and sell them as slaves. And essentially, like that commercial with the guy doing the mayhem, they can really do whatever they want. And John later on today is going to talk about what happens to, say, the Calusa Indians who get pushed down out of their traditional homeland here around the Southwest Florida coast and get pushed down eventually all the way into the Florida Keys. Before that happens, though, we have a little more history to do. We have some pretty good census data from those 18th century missions around St. Augustine, simply because they were around St. Augustine, and so it was easier for the Spaniards to sort of keep track of what was going on. But look at that, 1711, there are 11 of these, I call them refugee towns, mission refugee towns, with a total population of only 416. But as this mayhem continues, both in Florida and to the north, up into the area in the Carolinas, more refugees of other tribes, some even Creek Indians. There are some people called Chaluque that I always thought could be Cherokee, but I'm not sure, but who moved down, and so the population at the refugee villages start going up. And I especially like the 1717 census data that lists the names of the individual refugee missions and then talk about a little bit about who's at them. One of the things we often wonder about is when they say a mission had, 23 Indians living at it, do they mean adult males? Do they mean adults? Do they mean everybody? Likely adult males, but we're not certain. 1726, about 1,000 Florida Indians and other Indians are living in the missions. And then look at the numbers. They start going down, down, down. 1752, there's friars in St. Augustine at the refugee missions are still teaching the Indians, doing confessions with them, but there's about 200 people max at these 5 missions. Spain is in dire straits. They make an attempt to establish some more missions way out west that John's going to talk about near the Apalachicola and around Pensacola. The Jesuits make a comeback in Florida. They convince the governor in Cuba that a mission to serve refugees that was at the mouth of the Miami River would be a success. So Santa Maria de Loreto is started. The priests go there. There's really maybe 100 or so Indians there. They talk about Calusa being in the interior of Florida, hiding out. But by 1760s, that's long gone, and the refugees, because of the raiders, have been pushed all the way down into the Florida Keys. And it's essentially over for the Florida Indians. 1759, here's a wonderful map that shows there are only 2 missions left in St. Augustine, Nomine de Dios, that's been there from the very beginning, which is on the north side of St. Augustine, just north of the fort. You can go there now if you go to the shrine, what's it called in the West? I always say Nossa Senhora as I start talking Portuguese. Yeah, the La Leche shrine, which is there, you can visit it. The building itself, that is the mission, is a modern repro, but you can see how close it is to town. And then there was a second mission called Tolamato that was just outside the city gates of St. Augustine on the south side. And my dentist from Gainesville has a house there. And one day I was talking to him, and I said, "You have a house in St. Augustine?" "Yeah." And he said, "Yeah, you know, the thing, I planted something the other day, and there was this long tube." I said, "What? Was it a rifle?" He said, "Oh, I never thought so." I said, "Go back there and dig it up and find out." I never knew. He had a pistol that he dug up. So we know that area was used by the British in the 1760s and after that. So that was sort of it. That's the end of the Florida missions right there, 95 Indians being served. Then in 1763, because of these geopolitical things and a treaty, Spain cedes La Florida to the British, who take it over in 1763, and we have an East Florida, St. Augustine, a West Florida, Pensacola, and the remaining Indians who were in Pensacola, largely, I think this is right, John, isn't it, taken to Veracruz, and the people that were in St. Augustine were then taken to Cuba, to the town called Guanabacoa, which at one time was pretty well outside of Havana. Now it's sort of on the outskirts. But it was a town, and John may mention this later, where I believe that some of the Calusa Indians earlier had been taken. Is that right? And one of the great things was when historians, who I was amazed with this, went to the town of Guanabacoa, and they walk in and they said, "You got any records here about those Indians that come from Florida?" "Oh, yeah." Go to the church. They've got, the baptismal records and other things. And then the priest said, "Well, if you like this, go to the town hall, the Cabildo." And they found a list of the names of like 95, probably adult males, I think, that were taken to Guanabacoa from Florida. And in them is the one adult Timucua Indian who one assumes is the last living Timucua Indian that we know about. There may have been other Timucua still hiding somewhere in the state, and I would certainly think that they became part of what would be the Seminoles either. But here's this last living Timucua Indian, Juan Alonzo Cabale, who's a Catholic. We know from the records there that he was born at the La Leche Nuestra Senora de la Leche Church, the shrine. He died in 1767, and what was very interesting to me is that he was married to a Yamasee Indian woman. Why would he marry a Yamasee Indian woman? There were probably no Timucua women that were appropriate for him to marry because they wanted to marry someone from another clan, so forth. And then where are those two kids? What happened to them? Maybe one day we'll chase them. And because we're an equal opportunity group here, I should mention there were also 5 Appalachian Indians that are in that list, but I couldn't find the list to tell you what their names were, or I would have done it. Rochelle mentioned Gilmer Bennett. In the 1990s, an archaeologist, Donald Hunter, who was in Louisiana, went up into northern Louisiana to look for archaeological sites on a project. And he met some folks, and he says, "You got any Indian sites here?" And they said, "Well, no, but we're Indians. We're Appalachian Indians." He said, "What?" And indeed, the Appalachian Indians were living since at least 1836 in the area. Their traditional chief was Gilmer Bennett, who died, as Rochelle said, several years ago. And I love this photograph of his grandmother there in 1914. But they continued to be Catholics all up to the present. They had a Bible tracing their ancestry way back into the 19th century, a wonderful story. And as a result of Donald Hunter talking to them, they then were connected, as Rochelle said, with the people doing the research on the Appalachian Indians in St. Augustine, and here is Gilmer Bennett at the mission where his ancestors had been a very long time ago. But what an extraordinary story when you think about it of the Indians who were at these missions and their history during this time. And here, other than history, pretty much other than historical sources, we've lost them. They no longer have a presence in the world, which is, of course, very, very sad. However, Donald Hunter says there's another group of Florida Indians living out there in Louisiana, some of the Chateau, S-H-A-T-O-T, who are a group that move into Appalachia at one time and are living there in a mission when the system is destroyed in 1704. And they, too, went out into Louisiana. But for at least the present, they apparently have decided they were going to just keep a low profile and not step out there. But as I said, it's quite a story. And later this afternoon, we'll hear more.